Hey, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the book, The Only Witness, which is a Christian historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, I'm speaking with William West, and he is based in Down Under, and he's written a couple of books in one of his latest, and definitely excited to learn more about it. But let me tell you a little bit about him. He is a journalist and editor and has worked on national and international news publications for a half a century. After years of research, he has written an introduction for ordinary people to what he believes is the most profound puzzle of all time. And yes, I agree with it. It's definitely a puzzle, and it's either the world's greatest mystery or the greatest puzzle, but it absolutely certainly is. And that is, of course, the Shroud of Turin. William, welcome. It's so good to have you.
Great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us your backstory. How did you get involved in the Shroud of Turin?
Well, my backstory goes back to 1980. I was a young journalist, and I saw David Rolfe's documentary film, The Silent Witness. Did you see it back then, Guy?
I did not, but I have seen it since then. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
But in Australia, a lot of people say, it really started off their interest in the Shroud. It was given a cinema release, and like me, many people were impressed. Did even better in Britain, where it was made. It won an Academy Award, a BAFTA, and it's still worth seeing. I always encourage people, anyone who can get a copy, to watch it. Actually, an interesting fact, I only found this out recently. The director of The Silent Witness, David Rolfe, told me that the distribution rights in the United States were bought by Elvis Presley, of all people. Apparently, Priscilla Presley urged him to do it to encourage his faith. And he was reading a book about the Shroud at the time of his death. So that's an interesting fact anyway. The Silent Witness impressed me because it got a lot of the facts that we now know about the Shroud, and it put it in a really cinematic form. And soon after that, STURP came along. And you certainly know about STURP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project.
Absolutely.
Yes, dozens of senior scientists from the United States who were involved in space exploration and weapons research took a plane load of scientific equipment to Turin to investigate this religious relic. And most weren't even religious. Many thought they'd expose it as a painting in a few minutes. Barry Schwartz used to point that out. He was the Jewish photographer, the documenting photographer for STURP. Anyway, they thought they'd dispose of it in a few minutes and they'd take a holiday. Well, as we now know, they spent 5 days working around the clock, and they couldn't work it out. But one thing that they were sure of, it wasn't a painting. So belief in the Shroud exploded all over the world after that. But then, unfortunately, as we all know, in 1988, the carbon date was released, suggesting the Shroud was from the Middle Ages. And like most people, I knew nothing about carbon dating, but it seemed so scientific and final. I took it on faith in the science. I was young and naive. I'm not so naive now, I'm not so young. But that's partly because I spent many years working on our national newspaper, The Australian, mainly as an editor of the National Higher Education Supplement and as a legal reporter. And I'm now very aware that the behaviour of academics is not always beyond reproach. Anyway, over the years, I didn't give the Shroud a thought after the carbon dating came out until 7 years ago. I went into a Catholic bookshop and I saw a poster of the face on the Shroud hanging on a wall, and I thought, why would anyone want to promote that? It was carbon dated. But then, of course, I had to remind myself I knew nothing about carbon dating. And by then I wasn't so naive. So I started doing some research. And early on, I actually, I didn't begin it, but after doing a bit of research on both sides, I actually joined the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry in the United States. You would know about them.
Yes.
Yeah. I wanted to access the articles they had published about the Shroud in their Skeptical Inquirer magazine, and they'd been doing that for decades. So I went right back, and I've got to say I wasn't impressed. And the more research I read about the Shroud from other sources, the more I became convinced it had to be authentic. So I did a complete about-face and wrote my first book, Riddles of the Shroud, Questions Science Can't Answer. That was the first one up. And the more scientific and historical evidence I looked into, the more I realized it just wasn't a question anymore. It was authentic. It was the genuine cloth of Jesus Christ. And it had the blood that flowed from his heart when he died on it, and an inexplicable, unbelievable, mysterious image. Anyway, the more I looked into it, the more it just became blindingly clear. And at the end of my first book, Riddles of the Shroud, I listed 99 points of evidence indicating the Shroud was genuine. I stopped at 99 because I didn't want to give the impression the list was exhaustive. And as you know, Guy, the evidence for the Shroud's authenticity just goes on and on.
It certainly does. It's
Yeah.
funny, you were talking, sorry to kind of interrupt you there, but
No,
you were
you're right.
talking about
Yeah.
the Skeptical Inquirer. And
Yes.
what's funny is that so there's skeptics of the Shroud,
Yeah.
and they're very loud and boisterous about it. But there's no skeptics of the carbon dating of the Shroud that are not
Yes.
Shroudies. So you have non-Shroudies, so to speak, that are skeptics of the Shroud, but you don't have non-Shroudists that are skeptics of the carbon dating of the Shroud. And you would think that there would be skeptics on both sides that are
Yes.
that aren't just so so to speak politically or religiously or shroudly inclined.
Yes, exactly. So anyway, my main goal in that first book was to share the mountain of evidence indicating the Shroud was genuine.
Yeah, absolutely. So so now you have a new book which just came out, and I've been reading about that. I haven't started to read it yet, but it's called the Shroud Rises as the Carbon Date is Buried. So tell us a little bit about that and what's in there.
For sure. Well, for many people who swallowed the carbon dating, when they learn about what really happened with the carbon dating, they'll realize they were taken in. And for them, the Shroud will rise, I'm sure. And they'll bury the carbon dating without hesitation. It was just so wrong. But the oddest thing for me when I went into the carbon dating was how the whole thing was handled by the carbon daters. And you would know this. You've read Joe Marino's
Absolutely,
recently.
I've
You
got
got
it
that
right
big
there.
tome there. I've got it in
Big
my
tome.
bedroom. Yeah, exactly. I thought, will I carry it into the room that I'm doing this interview in? And I thought, no, it's too heavy. 800 pages. It's a
Yep.
lot to read, isn't it?
Well, it's funny. Joe's a good friend of mine now,
Yes.
and so he has a supplement to that. So that's 800 pages. He's got a supplement, which is whatever it is that you can download online. And now he's
Yes.
also been reading through a lot of archives from a couple of different sources, and he thinks he's probably going to have a couple of hundred more pages.
Is that right? Oh, well,
Yep.
most people would just shy away from that, a couple hundred more. But for me, that's exciting. He's done a great job there, and he makes it very clear all of the politicking that went on
Yeah.
behind the scenes, and how, as you say, the people who don't believe in the Shroud, they're a solid block, and they won't hear anything in favor of it. So, it's a bit of a problem communicating with them. But anyway, when the carbon daters announced their findings, they actually had a little table with 3 of the carbon daters behind, and behind them was this old blackboard, and it had these 2 dates chalked onto it. And apart from that, they were Middle Ages dates, 1260 to 1390. Apart from that, they had no written, published evidence to support what they were saying. But the most outspoken carbon data was Professor Edward Hall from Oxford University. At the time, very few people knew about that. Most, like me, had no idea. And the fact was that Hall was a veteran of promoting atheism. He used to give talks at the British Museum. He was sort of like an early Richard Dawkins. We didn't know that. And it's something that I first discovered when I read Ian Wilson's book, The Shroud, Fresh Light on the 2,000-Year-Old Mystery. But at that time, nobody knew. And in retrospect, the carbon dating looks extremely suspicious when you know all the background. Thank you, Joe. What happened was that during the dating process, the results were leaked to the media. And so, of course, a rushed media conference had to be held to make it all official. And it was held in a basement room at the British Museum. It focused on 3 men, and the one who did most of the talking was Professor Hall. And he was sitting down the left-hand side of the queue with his arms folded and looking very stern, with the blackboard behind him with evidence, 1260 to 1390. And he just burst out with all of this rhetoric, He said, Shroud of Turin was created by a medieval forger. And he had no evidence to support that contention. And then he said, anyone, after our carbon dating, anyone who in the future claims that it's real is just like a flat earther. And that would silence anybody who was ready to speak up and question the details. So it was a bit of a disaster for the people who really knew the facts about the shroud.
Yeah, it certainly was. And I remember in 1978 when some of the articles were coming out from STIRP, and then and I said, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. I wasn't really involved in, or even thinking about the shroud. It was just kind of an interesting, thing to kind of think of. Wow, there's a burial cloth that has a face on it, and it's kind of miraculous, and it's just interesting. And then in 1988 or 89, actually, I guess, when the results came out and were starting to be published and being socialized around the world, and then I go, oh, it was fake. So I basically ignored it after that. And
I did the same thing. I mean, it had that impact on most people, I think.
Yeah, and on so many people. And it's only now recently, with all of the books coming out and all of us kind of shroud authenticists, really getting back into it, and a couple of other things, and so it's fascinating to see how things are finally getting back, so to speak, into the norm with the study of the shroud.
Exactly. And the actual release of the findings of the carbon dating, the actual summary it was only a summary of the data, appeared, as you say, the next year in 1989 in Nature Journal. Many shroud researchers could see straight away something was seriously wrong. I go into this in detail in the latest book, The Shroud Rises. The full story didn't come out until recently, when all the original data was finally released. The carbon daters had refused for 28 years. Can you imagine that? 28 years they sat there. Every time someone said, can we look at the data? They said, no. It was just astonishing. I reported on academia for many years, as I say, for the national newspaper. And I'm sure things are similar in other countries, certainly in Britain and the US. You just don't get that. You don't get academics say, no, you can't look at the data.
The data is
Uh,
the most important thing. It's the most
exactly. And
important thing. If you have to be able to prove what you did based on the data that everybody agrees to.
absolutely. And it wasn't until the data was released only recently after a legal action under Britain's freedom of information laws that people could see the truth, people who are actually interested in the facts anyway. An awful lot of journalists out there who have no time for the facts, you know. They're just looking for a good story. But the whole thing reads like something out of a novel. And as they say, fact is stranger than fiction. In short, thanks to the release of the raw data, the suspicions of Shroud researchers that the carbon dating was flawed have now been very clearly confirmed.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and it really is fascinating in the that it took that long before the data was really released. So, what's funny is, when I think about it, and now, all of the different discoveries that have taken place about the carbon dating and what have you, and
Yes.
now in your book, the Shroud Rises as the carbon date is buried. So, what were the most startling discoveries that you found?
Well, after the release of the raw data, several articles were published in peer-reviewed academic journals confirming that the carbon dating was clearly wrong. But the academics tend to use very difficult terms like lack of homogeneity and heterogeneous data. What does the average person make of that?
Heteroscedasticity. What is that?
Exactly. Um, in layperson's terms, what they meant was that the figures didn't make sense. I mean, the dates that the three carbon dating labs, Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona, came up with failed a statistical test, a crucial statistical test used to establish whether carbon dating is reliable. The main test calculated the significance level of the carbon dating. Now, the higher the significance level, the more compelling the findings are likely to be. For instance, one of three control samples that were used at the same time as they carbon dated the shroud, so it came up with significance level of 80%. And that wasn't too bad. I mean, carbon dating is not a precise science when you look into it, but 80% was okay. And all three of the other samples were reasonable. They were much higher than the shroud sample. What they came up with the shroud sample, and this is buried deep down and is paid no attention in that first article in Nature Journal, it was only 5%. Anyone who knows about carbon dating or statistics knows that 5% is pretty ridiculous. I mean, it's the absolute minimum for carbon dating. To have any credibility at all, you've got to just inch over 5%. But when the Shroud researchers looked at that original data that was published in Nature Journal and recalculated the Shroud significance level using the same statistics that the carbon daters had put out there, found that it was really not 5% at all. It was 4%. Now, a lot of people might think, well, that's only 1%. What's the big deal? And I'm sure that the carbon daters thought to themselves, well, people will think, what's the big deal? But in fact, it's a big deal. To bump it up to 4% and have no evidence supporting that, to go from 4% to 5%, that was significant. And a lot of those early Shroud researchers twigged to this. And so they, as we know, they asked, give us the raw data. We want to have a look at that. And of course, they were denied, and it was just locked away. And the carbon data said no. But then they looked even further into some leaked figures, and they discovered that it wasn't even 4%; it was 1%. one chance in 100 that the carbon date was accurate. I don't know. I must be on another planet. When I look at that, I just think, game over. These people were either off on their own trip or they had another purpose in mind. One chance out of 100 that the figures were likely to be accurate.
Yeah. Well,
did you pick that up early on?
Yeah. It's only recently, but it's funny. I had a friend of mine, and he would say, "Well, we got 5% out of that, and that's almost 10%." And then well, and at 10%, that's almost 20%. But if we're at 20%, we might as well just say that we're at 50%.
Well,
And we just keep that's almost how they were trying to interpret a 5% and then a 4% and then a 1%. Well, 1% is almost 4. Well, 4. Well, let's round that up to 5.
And all of the dates were in the Middle Ages. Come on.
Yeah.
But they missed the whole point of it. The problem was that the carbon, just on that basis, the carbon date should have been rejected outright. It should have been thrown in the bin, and those carbon daters should have admitted publicly, look, we failed. But of course, they were introducing this new small sample technique, and their bread and butter relied on them having it accepted. So it was in their interest to, push it ahead and say, no, it's 95% accurate, which is just absurd. Anyway, it all went on for many years, as we know, for almost 3 decades, until the truth came out, and thanks to that freedom of information legislation. So, but the other thing that came out of the data was not only that what happened, they took only a tiny sample of the shroud, as we all know. I mean, originally, the whole proposal was that at least 3 samples would be taken from around the cloth, so that you get a good picture of what was happening on that piece of cloth. But in the end, they only took 1 sample instead of the 3, and they cut that into 3 pieces. So when they looked at the results from the carbon dating from Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona, they discovered that there was this strange pattern, and it was an increase from the bottom of the cloth, which was the Oxford sample, through the middle, Arizona, to the top one that was the closest to the body on the cloth. And there was a 130-year difference as you went up. And it was very clear and very steady. All of the little measurements that they made were dotted onto the graph. And the axis going through those dots showed you that it was increasing steadily. There was a clear linear increase in the dates as you approached the body itself. And this carries a story of its own, and it's a very big story. And it's one that was first identified by a physicist from Harvard University named Dr. Thomas Phillips. He wrote in the same edition that they published those summarized data from the carbon dating. He wrote a letter in, and he said, of course, all of this could be explained by the radiation, the idea that the image itself was caused by radiation, and that would increase the amount of carbon-14 on the cloth, so that the closer you got to the body, if there was a burst of radiation from the body that formed the image, the higher the date. And that would explain that that linear increase of 130 years that you got closer to the body. And that's been taken up by many shroud researchers now, including, and probably the one who's been most outspoken about it, Robert Rucker, who you've had on this podcast before. And he's a nuclear engineer, and worked. He played with these sorts of figures his whole career. He knows exactly what the picture is that emerged there. And the picture is that is evidence that radiation occurred, and that explains medieval date and all three of the medieval dates. Now, I know Joe Marino has his own theory about that. He's got this theory of invisible weaving, and that's a really powerful theory. I think that could still be right. Both theories can work together when you look at it. You know, sometimes carbon daters, my impression is they get aligned on one side or other. I think that the invisible weaving is the explanation. Others people say no, it's the radiation from the body. But you can have the radiation from the body without necessarily having the increase. Although that linear characteristic really grabs me. But if that's not the cause, then the invisible weaving may be, because the evidence for that is reasonably strong. Anyway, that's where I took that in my book. Yeah.
Yeah, and those are very fascinating arguments. And one of the things that, as you know, I've interviewed Robert Rucker, and
Yes.
When you draw that line of that 130 years per inch or whatever it is, I can't remember exactly how it goes, but if you just draw a straight line all the way to the center of the shroud where the head is, then the carbon date at that point would be 4,000 years into the future.
Exactly.
So
that's the point I made. Yeah. I made that in my first book. That was something I did understand even at that early stage, and I put it in the book, and it still stands. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about your first book and how then your second book, The Shroud Rises as the Carbon Date is Buried, differs from what you had in your first book, which was Riddles of the Shroud.
Okay. Well, my second book, the first book covered a lot. It was like an introduction to ordinary people of all this scientific information that most shroud researchers and scientifically minded people knew about. The average person, certainly in Australia, and I think it's the same in the US and Britain, most people sort of have a parting of the ways with science fairly early on when they're aged about 16 or so. Mind you, they can pick up some very basic, important things about science early on, and it's always there in the back of their head if they call on it. And I think something like the Shroud can help people call on that. But a lot of other people just don't want to know about it. It's just too complex. It's hard work and everything. I don't want that science. But they'll listen to the basic facts, and if you can get them just to focus on the results of science more than the actual process of it, they'll listen and they'll take it in. I started off with this first book, and at the end of it, I summarized. There were 99 points of evidence. And as I've said, I stopped at 99 because I didn't want people to think that it was conclusive, or sorry, exhaustive. It was conclusive, but anyway, so I did that. And when I came to I've actually got an anecdote in the in the second book about how, I first got out there and started defending what I said in the book. And I gave these public talks, and one of them was to a seminar of priests held in Sydney. And I went along thinking, oh, well, this is no big deal. It'll be pretty tame and all the rest. And when I arrived there, I was informed that Cardinal George Pell was in the audience. At afternoon tea, he came over to me. We knew each other. I wasn't close to him at all, but he had all of these terrible accusations against him and all the rest, which thank God he survived. Anyway, I won't go there. But he was very pleasant. He talked to me, and then at the end of the talk, he pointed to the room where I was going to give the talk, and he said, "I'll see you in there." It was like the headmaster calling me to his office. and you know about, most people know about Cardinal Pell. He was a very influential figure in the Catholic Church, and very outspoken, very intellectual. I don't know whether you've ever seen his debate with Richard Dawkins. It's a program in Australia called Q&A, questions and answers, and he stood up to Dawkins in very clear way, and he was a very strong speaker. He grew up in a pub and he played Australian rules, which is a very masculine game, and he didn't have any time for, he didn't take fools lightly, and anyway, I thought, well, hell, I'm really in for a debate here. So I wandered into the room and I gave my presentation, and I went for over an hour. I kept talking and talking, hoping that the facts would save me. And he had a copy of the book. He was the first to buy a copy of the book, and he was flicking through it, and he was looking at me and examining everything I said. And I had a screen there and showing all the images and all the rest. And then it came to our Q&A, and I thought, well, here we go. He's going to take me apart now. He didn't ask a single question. And then the Q&A came to an end, and there he was. And suddenly I noticed he was heading straight for me. And I thought, here we go. He's going to take me apart personally. And he reached out with his right hand and he shook my hand and he said, "Thank you for restoring my faith in the Shroud." Well, I just felt, great. I just thought, well, the truth is there. If people can absorb this truth, then they'll know that the Shroud is genuine. But then as time went on, I gave more and more talks. I realized that some people really still didn't give an inch because of the carbon dating. They just had this closed mind. So that's how the second book came about. I just kept thinking, well, I've got to look deeper into the carbon dating, and that's what I did. And the book outlines the whole thing. It's just amazing what they got away with.
Yeah, and I think stopping at 99. I don't know how many there are, and I think every day there seems to be some new little tidbit that
Yes.
is points in that direction of authenticity, and another one, and a big one, and a little one, and all kinds of different things. And I think what's also fascinating is not only that there are over 99 proofs, so to speak, of the authenticity of the Shroud, but they come from such a diverse set of fields of study. So you have the pollen
Yes.
dating, you have this
Yes.
dating, you have that, you now have the wax S dating. I mean, it's incredible how many different pieces and studies and things like that lead to then proof that the Shroud is authentic.
Exactly. I mean, and one of the things that I emphasize in both books is that the Shroud is a puzzle that only fits together one way. At first, the blood had to be on the cloth before the image appeared. This, as you know, is because researchers have shown that there is no image under the blood, and the image itself could only have been formed by, well, this is what I think the evidence points to, could only have been formed by a burst of radiation/light. That's because the image is on the very surface of the cloth, and it's made up of discolored microfibers. If fluid or gas had been involved, but the images in the image's formation, the discolored fibers on the cloth would have penetrated much deeper into the cloth. And if the body had been physically removed, the cloths would have been broken, but they're intact. So the only way the body could have been removed is if, in some mysterious way, the body dematerialized and passed through the cloth, just as John's Gospel infers that Jesus' resurrection body was able to pass through walls to enter a locked room. So that's extremely significant for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because now you mentioned, the puzzles, of course, the most profound puzzles of all time, or the world's greatest mystery. And so, what do you think are the biggest riddles that you've uncovered in your study of the shroud?
Well, there's certainly a lot of them. But of course, the biggest riddle of all is how the image was created. You would know that David Rolfe, who was the director of The Silent Witness, has made $1 million bet. And he first bet the British Museum that, they said because they overlooked the carbon dating, that it was done by a Middle Ages forger. And so if they said that, they must have thought that someone from the Middle Ages could have done it. But so he bet them, if you think someone from the Middle Ages had done it, and with all of your scientific researchers and all of your scientific equipment and everything, show us how they could have done it. And he said, if you can, I'll give you $1 million. And of course, they didn't hear a peep from the British Museum. So then when he went to the United States more recently, he extended the bet to the US and he said, if any researchers here can show me how it was done. And of course, nobody's come forward. And now I'm actually on a committee to organise Australia's first conference on the Shroud. And that'll be held in late June, from June 27 to 28. And he's coming out. He's going to be one of the main speakers at that. And he's going to bring the bet with him. He's going to dare all the Australian researchers. And I don't know if you know very much about the Australian academic situation, but we have a lot of universities that sell a lot of courses to people from Asia, particularly China. There are hordes of people from Asia coming into the country because we do have a reputation for a really high level higher education system. And so he's going to bet all these researchers too, and all these universities, to step up and tell him how some medieval forger did it. And of course, I doubt that anyone's going to take that bait, because a lot of people tried before the carbon dating, a lot of advanced scientists. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But so back to the riddles. I've got a list here. I've made a list to give you an idea how they go.
Well, while you're doing that, I think you're so right. The actual image formation is got to be right at the top. That's got to be number one. And
yes, exactly.
No question about it.
Absolutely, that's number one. The biggest of all is how the image on the cloth was created. As you know, it's a photographic negative image, and it existed for hundreds of years before photography developed. And as you know, in the 18th century, it all happened because advanced science fed on engineering to create the first camera. But somehow this shroud, that was at least as old as the Middle Ages, and clearly now from the first century, had this photographic negative image. The other thing is that the image is not only photographic, but it's 3D, three-dimensional. That's because the density of the image is greater for the parts of the body that are closest to the cloth. The parts of the body furthest from the cloth are less dense. So this explains the 3D quality of the image, but nobody knows how that was achieved. The image was able to show the body had rigor mortis, and that adds to the three-dimensional quality. How do you get an image that shows rigor mortis with the knees bent forward from the front as well as the back, with the measurements all exactly matching? It's just amazing. No artist in the Middle Ages could even contemplate something like that, and an artist could not have found how to do it, you know. And then you've got the other riddle is the primitive weave and herringbone pattern that is so unusual for a cloth from any age, but particularly from the Middle Ages. But somehow somebody in the first century got hold of it. And you do a very good job, I must say, in your book, The Only Witness, you know, with that little boy running around trying to get the cloth that his dad wanted to bury Jesus in. And then he found it, and he was worried, you know, his dad going to be angry with him for spending the whole 15 drachmas or whatever that he was given. And he got back, and his father was delighted. And he said, "This is just what we need, basically." You know, that was delicious. You know, that's it has that aroma about it, doesn't it? That, you know, it was all just, you know, hodgepodge as they went, but there was a hand guiding the whole thing, and it worked out perfectly. I mean, that's one of the big evidences against the carbon dating. You know, the British Museum searched all over the world for a herringbone cloth with similar primitive weave from the Middle Ages, so that they could use in the carbon dating, that they could use it to contrast with the carbon date. Anyway, they couldn't find it. They couldn't find it anywhere, but there it is. It's on the Shroud of Turin. Another riddle is that no artist, even in the Middle Ages, could have created the perfect blood flows and clots on the shroud. You know, we know that from that wonderful book, A Doctor at Calvary, which was written by one of the world's great experts, really, on blood and blood flows and blood clots. Anyway, I could talk about that for ages. But then another riddle is the microscopic deposits, I think you mentioned this earlier, of Jerusalem's rare limestone soil.
Yep.
I mean, that in itself, it's just extraordinary, isn't it? You know, that even the STURP scientists, they went through the whole body and they didn't notice this dirt until they got to the soles of feet, where it was all very concentrated. And then they got an expert on their team to look at it, and he said, "Oh, that's dirt. That's just dirt." And then they searched the rest of the body, got their microscopes out, and they found further deposits on the knees and on the nose, indicating that our Lord not only fell to his knees, but he fell on his face. And of course, after that, John Jackson and the other people at STURP took that to some of the world's leading experts to have it analyzed, that dirt, to have it analyzed. And they agreed it had the exact fingerprint of Jerusalem dirt. You know, it wasn't any accident, or wasn't, you know, some medieval research or carbon date. I'm getting lost here now. Some medieval forger, sorry, that's the word I was looking for. Forger would never have thought of that, to put these microscopic details of Jerusalem soil on the nose. And, you know, the riddle, that riddle is easy to answer.
Well, and that one too, you were a medieval forger, and you were based in Europe. You would have had to have sent somebody, or go yourself down to Palestine to get the, you know, that dust, that
exactly,
and or go to you know, Eastern Turkey to get the same dirt that they had, and the pollen. And you know, you haven't even talked about the pollen yet.
That's right. I was just getting, that was the next riddle. But you're absolutely right. I always think of that, you know, what's this forger in Europe in the Middle Ages thinking, well, you know, in the future, all of these scientists are going to come along and examine this under a microscope, and they're going to be looking for Jerusalem soil. I better go and, you know, get Joe over there to go and get some from Jerusalem. Didn't happen. Anyway, so then the next point, as you say, is the flower pollen. And that, again, has been examined and found to be the real thing from Jerusalem. And The guy who did that was from Europe, and he was attacked, and his character was undermined by the people who oppose the truth about the shroud. And it looked a bit grim there for a while because they were really doing a job on him. But then two Jewish researchers from Jerusalem looked at the evidence, the shroud, the pollen evidence, and they decided this is the real thing. These are definitely Jerusalem pollens, and they're not only Jerusalem pollens. They're from plants that only flower in spring in Jerusalem when Jesus was crucified. And that just seals the deal on the pollens. I got to say. I mean, how do you argue against that? And the answer is people don't.
Yeah, well,
anymore. Yeah.
Exactly. And the forger then would have had to have sent somebody from Europe down to Palestine in the spring.
Yes.
They would get there in the spring and then somehow, I don't know, shake all the bushes or whatever it is and gather up all of that pollen and bring it back.
Exactly. And there wasn't only the pollens from Jerusalem that they found. That Max Fry, that he was the guy that they who pioneered the whole pollen thing. He also found pollens showing a journey from Jerusalem through Eastern Europe, right up to Constantinople, where the shroud was for many years, and then after the Fourth Crusade, unfortunately, very unfortunately, looted Constantinople of all of its relics. The next time it comes up in history is when it surfaces in northern France. And it has pollens from northern France and from where it is now in Turin. So you've got the whole journey there illustrated by the pollens. So there's only one answer to that riddle.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
and then, sorry, I don't want to go on and on, but just a couple of really basic things, probably things that you know well, I'm sure things that you know already. I'm positive of that, but the blood chemicals, you've got these perfect flows, and the whole pattern of the blood on the shroud is real. It's real. But within the blood, when you put the blood under the microscope, you find blood chemicals that could have only come from someone who was tortured. The riddle here is, how can an artist get that blood on the cloth without the body of someone who was crucified with nails through the wrists and feet, and who was lanced through the heart? How could he get that blood with all those blood chemicals onto the cloth? These are things that pass through my mind constantly. Because as someone who supports the shroud, you think everyone's a little bit doubtful, and you've got some scientific evidence, but it's just amazing evidence.
Yeah, and it all kind of comes together, so you outlined 99, and each one of them builds on each other, and like we were talking about, comes from a totally different direction. So it is just fascinating. So
yes, just one last riddle. It's the riddle of the Sudarium of Oviedo, and you know all about that. The Sudarium is believed to be the face cloth that covered Jesus' face from Golgotha to Gethsemane. And for centuries, it was kept there in Jerusalem. But then with the onset of the Muslim fighters into Jerusalem, they moved it through northern Africa into Spain, and it arrived there in the 600s. And the fascinating thing is that it has the same blood patterns, it has the same Jerusalem soil, and the same flower pollens from Jerusalem, not the ones that go through the east across to Western Europe, but pollens that go through to Spain. And it all just comes together. You know, the face cloth fits the shroud itself. The face cloth was taken off the face. The shroud was then put on the body. It absorbed the same wounds, the blood from the same wounds. And, you know, it's just all so clear.
Yeah, yeah, you know, and you're right, you could go on and on, and that one is definitely a very good one as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, with my book, and I thank you for the mention of that, you know, of the little boy running around trying to get the cloth.
That's great.
Yeah, that was a fun story, you know, and actually that story I wrote almost 15 or 20 years ago when I was reading Ian Wilson's book, and I was thinking this ought to be put into a, you know, a historical fiction. But in any case, when I was writing the book, somebody asked me, "Well, what's the reason? Why are you trying to write this?" And I had, you know, and I thought about it. I said, "Well, what I want to do is I want to bring one person to Christ, and that's my mission, and that's my objective, and you know, and I think I've actually done that. I think
Yes,
I've done even more than just one. So, and because you know how hard that is, that's a very, very difficult thing.
absolutely.
Yeah.
We're
So
all natural skeptics, aren't we?
yeah, exactly. But so with your book, what is the one message that you would like to get across with now your latest book, The Shroud Rises as the Carbon Date is Buried?
Well, you know, the message from both books is that the shroud is genuine. It really is the burial cloth of Jesus. And this can be seen even if you look at a small part of the evidence. You don't have to go through the 99 pieces of evidence. You know, part of my reason for putting all that evidence in the first book was to give a comprehensive overview and a little bit to prove my own scholarship in researching the shroud, because I really respect a lot of the great researchers of the shroud, you know, people like John Jackson and all the rest who just poured their whole life into the project. And you know, they've done magnificent work. But so I wanted to be very comprehensive about it in that first book. But my view now is that the authenticity of the shroud can be seen even if you look at a small part of the evidence. Sure, you know, even the sorts of things that you and I have covered in this short interview, it should cement in people's mind that, you know, there's something going on here. There's a real mystery there. And the only answer to that mystery is that the shroud is real and that something supernatural happened there, not just something natural. You know, it just can't be explained with natural means. It goes beyond nature. You know, when I was a kid at school, there was a teacher was explaining the difference between natural causes and supernatural, and he made a real emphasis on the fact that supernatural causes are in line with natural ones. They're like a continuum into something we can't see. You know, so the supernatural thing sort of jumps out at you when you go through these. I mean, anyone, you know, that you might think, well, oh yes, you know, this bit of evidence might be explained by this natural thing, or that bit of evidence might be explained by this natural thing. But when you take them all together, there's something supernatural behind the whole thing that we just can't see, and natural things can't explain it. So yeah, that was the main thing, that the shroud is genuine. But these days I come back to a statement that was made by Tristan Casabianca, and you know that he's a very great researcher of the shroud. He was an atheist, and the shroud helped him convert to Christianity. And he was actually the one who was behind getting the details about the carbon dating released. He was the one who launched the Freedom of Information action to get them released. But he's asked the important question: do we really need more evidence about the shroud? And I think he's right. The evidence is already there, and it's been there. It's so compelling. And how could anyone with an open mind doubt the shroud is genuine? When you look at even a small amount of the evidence that we have now. It's wonderful. Every time there's some new dating of the shroud, like the Waxis dating that you mentioned, the wide-angle X-ray scattering, that got a lot of publicity this year. I picked up on it early and I put it in my first book. And nobody seemed to be reacting, but then suddenly the Daily Mail did a story on it, and it just was all over the world. There's a new dating the shroud. And I go, what have you guys been doing? You've been asleep all this time. It's been around for years. Anyway, so that came out. But yeah, I think Tristan Casabianca is right. The evidence we already have is so compelling. How could anyone with an open mind doubt the shroud is genuine?
Right.
And just to finish up, we've gone on for quite a while. I'm sorry I've gone over an hour here, but the other point I'd like to make is the shroud is not just about scientific evidence establishing that it is authentic. It's about what it tells us about Jesus. It tells us that he really did exist, that he lived and died just as the Gospels say, and that he had the body of a manual laborer who clearly worked very hard during his 3 decades on earth. Doesn't mean everyone's got to be a manual laborer, but our work is important. And he showed us that it was important by spending all that time doing it. And then, of course, he suffered the agony of the crucifixion, which the shroud illustrates, so that all sins could be forgiven. And the shroud even offers powerful evidence of his resurrection. I'm certain about that.
Yeah.
Whether or not you go with the idea that the carbon-14 testing was due to invisible weaving using medieval stitching, or that it was just a result of what is also very obvious, that burst of radiation. The fact is that the Shroud of Turin is real, and it's got a real message to convey.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great way to put it. And I really like your analogy of Jesus being a hard worker, or I don't know if he was a laborer necessarily, but he was definitely, he worked for to bring his message about, and then certainly then the suffering that he had for the resurrection, and that singular instance of as being the core of the whole Christian belief system. So
yes.
yeah, let me close, but 2 things. One is where can folks find your book, or both of your books?
Well, look, at the moment, particularly for people overseas, you can only pick it up on Amazon. It's so quick and direct. You get it Kindle, you can have it instantly, or you can get it printed. I know some people don't like buying things on Amazon, and I'm trying to work out other ways to sell it at the moment. I've got a few publishers who are interested, so that might happen. Look, if anyone's really desperate, they can send me an email on riddles of the shroud, one word, @gmail.com. And send me your address and whatever you can afford, and I'll get a copy and I'll post it to you.
Fantastic. So riddles of the shroud @gmail.com. That's wonderful.
That's right.
Yeah, you mentioned you have you're organizing a conference. Tell us about that.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's a big thing here in Australia. It's actually the first conference we've had in this country. There have been many other conferences around the world, but it's going to be held from June 27 to 29. The main speakers will include David Rolfe, who I've mentioned several times in this interview, and of course he was the director of The Silent Witness, and other 3 other documentaries about the shroud. They're very much worth having a look at, and Father Andrew Dalton, and he's developed a real. Yeah, he's got a great following online now, and well deserved. He travels the world talking about the shroud, and he does a great job. He's very erudite, very well educated, and he knows all the Greek and the Latin and all. and a lot of science as well. So he's very worth listening to. And then poor old me, who's just a journalist. And, we have a great notoriety for not getting the truth across. Hopefully, in this case, I am getting the truth across. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic.
So, and the conference will be opened by a bishop from the Archdiocese of Sydney, Bishop Richard Umbers. So there'll be a lot happening there. The talks. There'll be a big dinner at the launch, and then talks from all these people and others. And then the final day will be David Rolfe giving a presentation on his latest documentary film, Who Can He Be? So it should be a great project. And, everyone's welcome, even people from overseas.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I wish I could get down there for that. It sounds like fun.
Yeah.
Because we've got a conference coming up as well here in the U.S. in St. Louis at the end of July.
Yes, I know. Yes.
Yeah, so
Wonderful.
hopefully, some of the Australian folks can come up here, and some of the Americans can go down there and
Yes.
more about the Shroud.
Yes, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, William, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate it, and it's been very informative. And it's always interesting to, there's always a couple of little pieces of information that it gets added to the overall understanding of the Shroud and all the different pieces of it. So, thank you so much, and I really appreciate it. So,
thank you for having me, Guy.
yeah, absolutely. And then for the audience, of course. Please stay tuned for many other videos in this series on the backstory of the Shroud of Turin. And if you can, please visit GuyPowell.com and sign up for more episodes. And if you like this episode, please, please, please rate it with 5 stars. William, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Guy.